Okay, guys, welcome to another Capstone Chat. Today it's kind of interesting. We have somebody who I actually didn't teach as a student. He graduated in 2003. His name's Andrew Iden, and he's coming into us on Zoom from Atlanta, where he is a writer, TV news and documentary producer, and podcast host producer for HLN, the sister network to CNN. He's done a lot of work in the covering some pretty high profile true crime things like there was some OJ Simpson mentioned, and he now has a podcast called Down the Hill as well. But please welcome Andrew. And Andrew, you've got the stage.
Thank you, Monica. I really appreciate it. Let me begin by saying you are all welcome to interrupt me at any time with questions. Do not be shy. I am open to them all. So just as a jumping off point, I am a 2003 mass communications Shepherd college, not university graduate, which really makes me feel old. But so I graduated in 2003. I came to Shepherd with a print journalism background and had got my first job in news as a 17-year-old sports writer for the local paper in my hometown of Front Royal, Virginia, which is just about an hour from Shepherdstown. Um, Came to Shepherd and did radio, did video production, worked for the Picket, kind of dabbled in all the communications things. And once I graduated, I went to apply for a position with CNN here in Atlanta, which was the job was called a video journalist. And the irony being that the job requires no video work, nor does it require journalism. It's really the entry level position at CNN, which is I was the guy that put the microphone on the anchors, put the earpiece in their ear, made sure the anchor was at the desk when the show began, because believe it or not, they are not always on time. Um, got them coffee. Yes, got them coffee. So that was the entry level job. And so I did that job for a little while, and then I moved on to the media operations department, which was I was tasked with making sure all the video that came in from around the world, from CNN's bureaus in the Middle East, Baghdad, England, Saudi Arabia, Hong Kong. My job was to make sure that video got fed in accurately, and to let people know in various teams that the video had arrived and was in our big server to begin being used, whether it was a news conference or something from the field. So I did that for a little while. And then I moved on to a show in 2005 as an associate producer for a show called Nancy Grace, which some of you may be familiar with her and her volume. um, she is a true crime. She's a former attorney and hosted a show with her name on it on HLN, which used to be CNN Headline News. Way back in the day, they did like a 15-minute. Every 15 minutes, they give you the news, but they changed the format in 2005 to more traditional hour-long shows. And so I spent about 9 years with Nancy Grace as an associate producer, as a producer, line producer. I was the guy in the control room that kind of told her when we needed to hit commercial breaks. I told her, when the guests were ready, that kind of thing, and kind of communicated with her in her ear about any kind of new information we had coming in. So I was there with Nancy Grace until 2013. And then from 2013 to about 2016, I was a assignment editor for CNN Worldwide, which is, when you think about the folks at CNN who do the actual news gathering, that is the assignment editor. That's the job that requires 3 phones to your ear. One phone is a photographer at a breaking news event. The other phone is the control room asking when the reporter is going to be ready. And then the third phone is the police who are trying to funnel the information to you as accurately and as quickly as possible. So that job I did for about 2-3 years. And then I moved into more long form and I started working for HLN again. And I worked for a woman by the name of Ashleigh Banfield, who is a longtime network anchor. We did some long form work with her. I spent a week in Huntington, West Virginia, actually doing a special on opioid addiction and heroin addiction. Um, it was some fascinating work. So moved into long form, and then I also joined the team at HLN that is called the HLN Original Series team. And so we do hour-long true crime documentaries. We cover stories that you may or may not have seen before. It is very much akin to the Datelines, 2020, those kinds of shows, the ones that are on, Friday nights and you don't want to watch with the lights off because they're terrifying. um, and then actually in 2018, I launched my own podcast, which was really an attempt to flush my head of all the horrible, horrible news that I'd covered for so long. And the podcast I launched was called the 2180, which was basically a storytelling series from the point of view of the men and women who have hiked the Appalachian Trail from start to finish. And so the whole goal of that series was to hear, in the words of the people that have done it, what that experience is like. Obviously, it's about a hike, but I learned over the course of 40 or so episodes that for a lot of those people, it is not about the hike. It's about some other kind of journey that they're on. And it was really an interesting kind of exploration into kind of the human condition. So that was my jump into the podcast universe. And then on the heels of that, the folks at my network said, "Hey, we actually want to jump into the true crime podcast space. And we know you do audio work. Could you work with us on a true crime show?" So in February of 2020, we launched a podcast called Down the Hill, The Delphi Murders, which is about a murder case in the small town of Delphi, Indiana, and the murder of two teen girls. And it's their search for the killer. It's currently an unsolved case. And so we worked on that podcast for a year, multiple trips to Indiana, establishing relationships with the family, getting to know people, law enforcement, witnesses, family, friends, townspeople. That podcast, we distilled that down to 9 hours, 9 episodes across, about an hour each. And that podcast did extremely well. We just crossed, I think last month, we crossed the 15 million download mark. And we in this past February, just last month, we produced or we aired a 2-hour TV adaptation of the podcast, which I was a producer and reporter on. And so we took the podcast and we put it on television, which on the surface sounds a little bit counterproductive, but we really used a lot of kind of advanced film techniques and documentary style production to kind of illustrate the sound that you heard on the podcast. And so we made that adaptation. That show did incredibly well. I'm extremely proud of that. You can see that on Hulu. Shameless plug. And now I am currently with the HLN Original Series team, still doing true crime documentaries. I'm working on 2, 3 right now. And so that's kind of the distilled, condensed version of my story. There's a lot of twists and turns and little side paths to that, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts of my journey in the TV, podcast, writing, journalism universe. It's been something. There are times it's frustrating, but there are also times it's extremely exciting. I don't know how many of you guys are on the journalism path or on the television path, but it's I remember when I was in your shoes, my thought was, man, that must be a really cool job. And I can tell you that it is a really cool job. There are times it's frustrating, obviously, and just like anybody else, there's times it's just a job. But there are often times I have to stop and kind of remind myself that I'm doing something that I don't think a lot of other people get to do or have the opportunity to do. And so, it really is worth reminding myself of that, because there is, it is worthwhile work. So that's kind of my story. I don't know if I burned through that too quickly or not. But that's kind of where I am now. So I would open it up to any questions anywhere.
So I have a question. I'm personally like an aspiring producer, and producing a series on true crime is like a dream of mine.
Okay.
So, as someone with a handful of experience as a production assistant and an assistant producer, where, if I were to apply to a company like the one that you work for, what position would you suggest that I apply for to work my way up to become a producer of true crime documentaries?
Right. Well, I can speak to CNN specifically. CNN does a very good job of taking people at entry level positions and giving them the opportunity to try things at different places. And by that, I mean, well, let me first just answer your question, which is, if it's CNN, I would encourage you to apply for one of the entry level positions. They have a position in Washington D.C. called a news assistant, which is essentially the job that I had here in Atlanta, but it's just in Washington. And so that would be my first bit of advice, is to go after those entry level positions there, get your foot in the door, because one of the great things about CNN as a whole is, like I said, you get the opportunity to do a lot of different things. You meet a lot of incredible people too, and you never know when those people are going to become great connections for you. Um, so that would be my first bit of advice, as far as positions are concerned. Uh, and I know that other networks, ABC, CBS, they all have similar positions, and they call them all kinds of different things. But news assistant, stage manager, um, I'm not sure what the others call them, but they all have some varying degree of that position. It's a lot of that is this. A lot of them are the same. It's the same. It's designed for people right out of college. Um, the beauty of television, though, is that television is inherently a medium where there's never enough people to do all the work. And that's a good thing, because when you're a news assistant, when you're an entry level employee, you never know when someone, if you're in DC and you're a news assistant, you never know when Wolf Blitzer might turn and go, "Hey, Taylor, I need X, Y, and Z. Can you get that for me as quick as possible?" It might be research. It might be, some sort of AP report that he saw somewhere. But that's not necessarily part of your job. But those positions, the beauty is that your job is whatever is asked, and you're in contact with people who are very influential, and you're in contact with people who know a lot of people, and I will tell you that those people remember that. So that might be kind of a long roundabout way of answering your question, but I know that there's oftentimes a lot of emphasis on how fast you can move up the ladder when you get into those first jobs. But one of my bits of advice would be to master that job first, um, because that really goes a long way.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, I also have a question. I saw you do some freelance in baseball writing, and I'm also interested in sports writing as well. So I was wondering if you ever went down that path in sports writing and saw after like a job in that field.
It's funny. I actually, if you'd have told me when I was at Shepherd that you're in 15 years, you're going to be working at HLN covering true crime, I would have laughed at you, because I would have said, no, I will be working for NFL Live in Bristol, Connecticut for ESPN. Sports writing and sports media was all I ever wanted to do since I was about 9 years old. Um, I wanted to do that so bad. And, up until a couple of years ago, I was still trying to figure out how to make a move into sports. CNN does not have a very big sports representation. However, um, right as I got out of college, I got the job at CNN, but I had applied as a sports writer at about 15 different newspapers around Virginia. I wanted to be going to games, writing, covering games, writing columns. But the newspaper industry was also in the midst of a huge change. And so I realized at the time that while those jobs were still there, I might be better served jumping into something like CNN. That, I mean, obviously they offer me a job. Um, but to answer your question about sports, um, freelance sports writing is difficult. And my suggestion would be, if you want to be a freelance writer, that really requires establishing contacts and knowing people before you become a freelancer. I think the structure normally is people get a job, as a full-timer, whether it's at the Washington Post or, the Martinsburg Journal, whatever the local outlet is, and you develop a file of clips and people get to know you over time, and then you can make the jump in as a freelancer. Freelancing is hard. It requires a hustle. I tried it for a couple of years and it worked, but it was not going to be long-term for me. I just couldn't do it because it's extremely hard. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm being discouraging, but because I'm not. But in order to become a freelancer, it's hard to just begin as a freelancer, if that makes sense. You have to establish yourself. People have to know who you are and they have to know what they can expect of you. And that's when you've developed that core work ethic and reputation. Then people know, okay, I need a story about X and Y. I know Ryan can do it. I'm going to call him. So my suggestion, if you want to be a sports writer, would be to start out on staff somewhere, work through that for a couple of years, and then see if you're at a place where you can become a freelancer.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'll actually have a question.
Go for it.
Oops. I've got spam coming in on my phone. Never mind that. You mentioned that you did the TV version after the podcast for your
Yes.
Down the Hill.
Yeah.
When you were originally going down and, on site and doing your interviews and things like that, did you shoot any video with that thought, or were you only doing audio when you were down there?
So we, it's funny you mentioned that, because we did 98% of our interviews for the podcast were audio only. And so we were faced with a challenge when we wanted to make the adaptation to television. Okay, well, how do we put this on television if it's only audio? And so one of the things we did is we identified, as we were writing and producing the television version, we identified what portions of the podcast we wanted to use, obviously. And we identified what themes people were going to be talking about from those audio interviews. And so one of the things we did is we went back to Indiana and we spoke to those same people and we had brief interviews with them talking about those same themes. So when it came time to produce the television show, we could show those people having those conversations on camera, but then we could use the audio from the podcast and segue into that and use, B-roll, different video elements to cover what they were saying. So it almost appears they start out on camera by saying X, Y, and Z. You start to see something else and they continue what they're saying, only what they're saying is from the podcast, which was challenging because we had to, I work with TV people. And so there was when we made the podcast, there was a lot of questions about, wait, there's so much good stuff here. They say, the interviews were so great, but they're not on camera. And I had to explain to people and kind of tweak their thinking of like, that's okay, because that means we have to come up with a different way to show it. And just because we don't have them speaking on camera doesn't make it any less effective. In fact, in a lot of ways, it makes it more effective if you hear it and don't see it. And one of the other things that I had to explain, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but one of the things I had to explain to our bosses, who are all, kind of grizzled TV folks who, and through no fault of theirs, but they've been working in TV for 25 years. So they're very, TV oriented, is they had a hard time letting go of the concept that, wait, you're going to go up there and do 25 interviews and not have a TV camera? And I was like, trust me when I say, you'll be shocked at how much better the interviews can be when there's no cameras, because cameras inevitably change people's behavior. It does not matter how comfortable they say they are. Either some clam up, some get nervous, some go the other direction and get too over the top. And it's like, well, that doesn't really help. And it didn't take me long to make that case to them and for them to believe it, because we'd come back and we'd play some of the stuff that we got. And they were like, they'd never have said that if there were a camera. And so I think part of our ability to make it work for television is that we didn't shoot it with a camera, if that makes sense. It sounds completely contradictory.
So you would follow that same kind of process if you had another show to do, you think?
You mean a podcast?
Yeah. Or if you were going to do something that was a podcast and a TV show, would you
Right.
follow the same kind of process, do you think? Did it?
Probably. I mean, this was the first time I've ever done a TV adaptation of an audio product.
Right.
And we found that using that strategy worked.
Okay.
I have seen documentaries that were all audio and the only video cover was just B-roll. In fact, there's kind of a famous documentary from I can't remember the director, but it was about Kurt Cobain from Nirvana, and they had unearthed hours of these audio tapes of his that he had done these interviews, and so they turned them into a film, but they had no video. So the entire 75-minute film is just video of where he lived. And somehow I managed to watch all 75 minutes and found it engaging, but you never see him. All you see is video of, neighborhoods and towns and cities. And it was like,
I think I saw that. Yeah.
yeah. So, there's ways you can do this that I think a lot of times people are afraid to push the boundaries. But I think, obviously we're in a world now where content is delivered in so many different ways that there is now permission to push the envelope a little bit that didn't exist before.
Hey, Andrew, I have a question as well.
Go ahead.
So seeing as like the beginning of your Down the Hill podcast was right around the beginning of COVID, like early February, March of last year, did you happen to see an uptick of views, seeing as more people began to stay at home?
We did. I mean, we'd been working on the podcast for about a year before the first episode was actually out. And so the first two episodes came out February 14th of 2020 and February 21st. So we released them, a week apart. And I would say that initially our publicity push for the podcast actually was hindered a bit because of COVID, because the publicity push was around the middle of February, and early March, as you know, was the peak of the COVID scare, the beginning of quarantine. And so I think in some ways our publicity push was squashed a little bit because there were so many other things going on. With that said, though, as quarantine went on, we did see a climb because, yes, people were home. So the benefit was people were home and had more time to consume content. The negative was there was a lot of things going on, and for us to break through with our publicity push was difficult.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Sure.
I have another question. Is it okay if we were to connect or reach out to you on LinkedIn after this if we come up with any other questions for you?
Sure. Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I'm pretty sure I'm the only Andrew Iden. There might be one other one, but I'm the only one with a beard. How about that?
I have a question.
Go for it. Who am I looking at?
Christian Anderson.
Oh, hey, Christian.
Yeah. Was there any podcasts that you enjoyed before making your Down the Hill podcast that, like, I guess inspired you to make your podcast?
Yeah, there's a ton. And now that you've asked me, I can't think of them off the top of my head. However, I will say, kind of the granddaddy of them all is Serial, which was done in 2016, I believe. That podcast kind of made, blazed the trail for true crime specifically. I think that was a revolutionary project that really kind of gave people an inkling of what audio can and can be and is. And one of I also, just to name a few, there's a podcast from the CBC called Uncover, and they follow a different story every season. And I think I'm not sure if it was last season or the season before, but they just did a season about the NXIVM cult in New York, and Keith Raniere, and how he had kind of recruited these women in these horrible, horrible ways. There's one also, they did one called Satanic Panic, which was about the 1980s and this kind of cultural phenomenon that was going around that I'm sure nobody except for Monica and I remember, which was this, there was this fear amongst parents everywhere that their kids were being recruited to be in these satanic cults. And so the podcast really breaks down kind of like how that all came to be, why that was. Turns out it wasn't nearly as horrible as everybody thought, but it was like, it was insane. There's also one called from Oregon Public Broadcasting called Bundyville, which is about the Bundy family out west that got into a armed standoff with the United States government a few years back. And it really dives deep into kind of the different generations of the family and their spiritual beliefs and how that clashed with American law. And it's fantastic. And I will say, just from a generic standpoint, and this is just kind of me on my soapbox for a minute. Podcasting is an interesting medium because I think, there's a lot of shows that are a couple folks with a microphone who are talking about, whatever the topic is. And those are fantastic. However, I think those sometimes miss the mark. And I think what I am drawn to is the storytelling element, and the kind of the documentary reporting, research, writing, taking something in that documentary structure and unrolling a story over the course of however long the podcast is. And so those are the ones that really resonate with me, in terms of the podcasting space. And that's not to say anything disparaging about the others. I just, I consider them two very different elements.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I have another question. I'm just filled with questions because I think this is interesting. So you've done all these true crime, podcast, etc. And I have no doubt that when you're going in and starting to talk to people and do your investigative reporting, that you probably come across some very delicate situations.
Very.
Yeah, I would assume. And, people that are probably grieving the loss of children and things like that.
Yes.
What kind of, do you think about it before you go in, where you're going to draw boundaries, or what kind of, just your ethics as a journalist? How do you balance that with the need for revealing the truth?
Yeah. It's a good question. And it's one I think about a lot. I've had a lot of conversations about this topic specifically. There is when you are a journalist, there is and I can't even really describe it, but there's a general understanding on the parts of the public and the people that you're talking to, especially in this space. There is usually a general understanding that you, the journalist, are going to be asking them things that are not easy. You're going to be asking them to tell you details about the most horrific, awful things that have ever happened to them. And I think people in general know, and it's not every case, but generally people know it's coming, right? They know that you're not going to come ask them about the weather. With that said, though, I think all you can do is be a human being. And that sounds kind of, I don't want to say cheesy, but it's true, because what you're doing is, besides being a journalist, you are being a human being and asking them just questions that, other people would want to ask them. I had on kind of the surface level, what I would advise people to do, especially in this space, is before you have a camera, before you have a microphone, before you hit record on anything, you should have probably had a conversation with those people beforehand. That's not always possible, but when you can, have a conversation with them, explain to them what kind of conversation is coming. They probably will know. That doesn't mean you tell them what you're going to ask them, because that kind of clouds your journalistic, path. But give them an understanding of, hey, I'm going to be asking you some things that aren't easy. I think empathy is important. For Down the Hill, we had a lot of very, very difficult conversations, and it was one conversation in particular was probably the hardest interview I've ever done. Not from a standpoint of, it being combative or anything, but I was sitting in this woman's house asking her questions about the brutal murder of her daughter. And her daughter's bedroom was 10 feet away. And so while we were having the conversation, I explained to her before we even began recording, I said, Anna, I know this is not going to be easy. I want you to take your time, and I want you to just, I understand this is not going to be easy for you. And I told her that I appreciated the time. I appreciated her candor. So I think at the most basic level, what you can do in this genre specifically is appeal to people that you are a human being and you are coming to them as a human being. That's all there is to it. And you have to have empathy and understand that you're asking them horrible things and very, very, very painful things that they have to regurgitate for you. And so I think if you do that, people understand. There's latitude they will give you. It doesn't make the interviews any easier, but it also gets people to open up. I mean, if you can establish, a trust too. There's such an important thing to point out, is that you also need to have the people you're talking to understand that you're getting from them these horrible, horrible experiences in this awful, awful story, but they have to trust you that you're going to do the story properly. And, when we did Down the Hill, I said to the other folks that worked on this with me, the other producers, I said, look, I don't really care about ratings and reviews on iTunes. I don't care about, Twitter or Facebook and comments. What I care about is when we're done with this project, if the parents say this story was done with truth, honesty, and accuracy, and with care, that's what I'm worried about. So I ranted a little bit. I don't know. I kind of rambled, but that's a really important. I'm glad you asked that question, because it's a really important thing that I think oftentimes is overlooked.
Okay, so I think that I'm next. With a podcast, how do you come up with your topic, and how's the timeline for your specific season? And does location play any factor in your decisions?
Well, I've been blessed with, being employed by a company where, we did this before COVID. So location wasn't really a problem. My company is very good at saying, if this is the project we're doing and you need resources X, Y, and Z, if you have to go back for a week and spend another week 2, 3, 4 times, you can do that. So, location wasn't really an issue. Story, I think you're asking kind of like story selection, right? It's so funny, because as you get older and advance in the kind of the journalism universe, you just kind of pick up elements of a story that will have you intrigued. And people will pitch stories all the time, and I don't want this to be a cop-out answer, but you kind of just know. The story in Delphi, for instance, was kind of a no-brainer. I mean, we had the murder of 2 girls, teen girls. The murderer was on camera, he was on tape, and there was a picture of the killer. And we are 4 years removed, and they don't know who he is. So that on the surface, I mean, that just screams a story, right? Every time you think you know what the elements of a story are that are going to make a great story, they will also change. And so, picking a story is incredibly difficult. The other thing is, and I maintain this to this day, and I've gotten into arguments with people about it at work, you cannot have a good story unless you have good characters. And so if you have, and I'm going to come back to the Delphi story. One of the compelling things about that story is obviously everything I just mentioned about the killer being on video, but we also had compelling characters. We had a state police superintendent in Indiana who spoke like something out of a film. We had a grandfather who had this relentless pursuit of justice for his granddaughter's murder, who would speak on camera and on tape at the drop of a hat and did it with passion and with honesty. You had, the backdrop of this small town in Indiana, which is no different than Shepherdstown or Martinsburg or Winchester. And it just was this snapshot of Americana. So that's a perfect example of like, we had all of these things that came together and it was like, I mean, this is a fantastic story. It's just, it's got all of these ingredients. So I hope that answers your question, but you'll learn over time, there will be points where you're not going to have to say, is that a good story or not? You'll just know right off the top of your head. And there are other people that may disagree with you too. I mean, I have arguments all the time with senior producers and executive producers at our network. And I'm saying, why aren't we doing this? And they're like, doesn't really move me. I don't know if that's going to work. And I'm like, what are you talking about? So, if you truly believe a story is a story, continue to pound the table for it. Because if you really, really do believe it's worth it, that will come through in your reporting too. Did we already get Maddie's question?
No, I was next.
Okay.
So my question kind of pertains to your podcast that you did about the Appalachian Trail.
Sure.
What kind of inspired you to do that? Because I know you said you needed to get your mind off of all the terrible things you did, but why the Appalachian Trail? I'm just curious.
Sure. So I grew up in Front Royal, which I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's just an hour outside of Shepherdstown. The AT, I worked at a summer camp in Front Royal, and the AT ran right around the corner from where the summer camp was. And so when I worked up there, it was not uncommon to see hikers come down, take a shower at the pool, get themselves squared away for the night, whatever. And so as a teen, I always thought AT hikers were like the coolest guys or girls there were, just because they were these people that just wandered out of the woods, disheveled and smelly and but they were just so cool because I was like, they're walking to Georgia or they're walking to Maine. So I've always thought that. I am 41 years old and I still think that. And so I needed to do something, like I said, that just kind of got me out of the horrible stuff of true crime. And I always thought a series of people telling their hiking stories. And the important thing to note is that the podcast, you don't really hear me. It's all their voice. It's kind of a first person narrative, confessional style. And so I always thought, that would be a fantastic series just to hear people talk about why they did it. And, the experience they had. So I originally wanted to do it as a video series. I was, working on the idea and thinking about pitching it as a video series. Well, one of the things I love about podcasting is there's not nearly the amount of gear that video requires. There's no lights, there's no cameras. And so the other thing is basically, I just knew people were going to be more honest on a microphone too, like I said before. And so, after about 4 or 5 interviews, I was like, man, this is so not about the hike at all. People were getting into kind of deep, telling me about trauma. And I was like, I'm trying to get away from that, but whatever. And so, but people were talking about why they did it and what it was that inspired them or what they learned about themselves. And I just, after about 4 or 5 interviews, I was like, this is way better than I thought it would be. And so, it was basically just, I was inspired just by my childhood of growing up and living near the AT and going for walks in the woods. And it's nothing more elaborate than that, but that was it.
No, it's super interesting. Thank you.
Sure. Does that mean Terrence is next?
Yeah, that's me.
What's going on, Terrence?
What's going on? So I had a question. You said you worked with Nancy Grace. How was that? Because I remember being flipping through channels and just when I see Nancy Grace's I don't know, it seems so hectic when I saw that.
That's a word for it. So here's what I always say about working for Nancy Grace. She was incredibly, incredibly passionate about what she did. And she pushed us as producers to try to clear, like, working for her was one of those situations where, you know, if an obstacle was in your way to get something or whatever, if there was some sort of challenge in front of you, she didn't care. You needed to figure out a way to get around it. And so I am now much more dogged in my pursuit of things than I would have been had I not worked for her. Now there were also challenges to working for her. She was incredibly demanding. You know, there were times I was like, why is she screaming at the television all the time? There were challenges, but, you know, I always look back at that time as I learned the importance of not letting an obstacle get in my way and learning how to, you know, if a wall jumped up in front of you, you figured out how to go around it or go underneath it. Or, okay, if I'm going down this path, I'm not going to get what I need doing it this way. Let me try a different way. And so, you know, I spent 8 years doing that. And I am always grateful for what that experience kind of like taught me to be. You know, I had towards the end of my time with her, our executive producer called me and said, hey, we're sending Nancy to a prison in Phoenix, Arizona, and she's going to sit down with women behind bars. And I need you to go out and produce a 2-hour special, like a documentary. And that's literally all the guidance I had, which was a blessing and a curse. The blessing was I had a blank canvas to start with. The curse was I had a blank canvas to start with. But you know, it's funny, this was before Orange is the New Black, but it was real life Orange is the New Black. We took Nancy into a prison, a woman who's, you know, renowned for not having a lot of patience for criminals. And we got to see a whole different side of her. She got to meet these women and spent time with them. And, you know, I was going into this prison every day for 2 weeks with, you know, I had to walk on the left side of the hallway. Nancy and I did. And I had to make sure, you know, I didn't have any kind of contraband on me. I was treated just like they were from a security standpoint, but it was a blessing and a curse. And I look back and I think, you know, I'm not sure I would have gotten that opportunity in another universe. But because of her, I learned how to go around things and hurdle challenges. Otherwise, I wouldn't do.
Very cool. Thank you.
Sure. Chelsea, you're up.
Hi. What do you think would be the most important skill for a graduate to have if they wanted to go into something like TV production?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say, do you mean TV production like news or TV just in general?
More so news.
News. So here's what I always tell people about news. Whether it's TV, whether it is, you know, the internet, streaming, digital video, podcasting, whatever it is, if you can master the art of writing, you can master any of those. Because, you know, we talk about attention spans and how people don't read things anymore. And while that is somewhat true, you still have to write television. You still have to write scripts for podcasts. And people don't realize what makes something good is your ability to craft it with words. But people don't realize that. So anytime you hear someone talk about how great something was that they saw on TV or heard in a podcast or something, I maintain that it starts with the words. And, you know, you can learn to run a camera, you can learn to put up lights, and you can learn to write, but also writing is something that, you know, since the beginning of time, good writers are always necessary. And so I would stress to anyone that if you want to work in media, it starts with the words on the page.
Thank you.
Sure. Who's next?
I think I'm next.
Go for it. I don't want to mispronounce your name. How do I say your name?
Ai.
Ai. Oh, just like it's spelled.
Yeah. So my question is, how'd you go about starting your own podcast, and what are some steps you had to take?
Starting my own podcast was interesting. It really was, I had the idea. I did some research about gear, and I realized all I really needed was like a good microphone, and a recording device. And I thought, once I have those two things, I pretty much have everything else I need. Um, so I did a lot of reading of it, and it's not terribly difficult. That's the beauty of podcasting, is that the barrier for entry into the podcast universe is very low. That's also why you literally have 2 million podcasts. um, so I got a microphone, this microphone here. I got a Zoom recorder, which this microphone plugged into. And really the hard part was the editing, and the work that went in after the interviews. I'd research who to talk to and who to interview, and that wasn't terribly difficult because of that community. Everyone is so close knit. It was like, I started with 5 names, and then everybody else would just kind of suggest people. But I got a microphone and a recorder. I did the interviews, and that was the easy part. The hard part is listening to the interview, transcribing the interview, figuring out what portions of the interview you want to use, writing the podcast. So my suggestion for anybody that wants to get into podcasting, I would start by looking at your idea, see if that idea exists already. And if it does, that's not a negative, but think about how you can do it differently. And, think about the work that's going to go into putting it together, because I did 40 episodes every week. And my initial plan was to have about 10 episodes done before I launched. So you have some lead time. Well, that started to shrink. So it got to a point where I was basically pumping out a podcast every Wednesday. And so Tuesday night, I was up until, 2 a.m, trying to finish this mad dash to the finish line. So, the gear is relatively simple. But I think as much time as you spend on gear and, production, you should spend just as much time, if not more, on your idea and how you want it to be shaped. Amanda, you're up.
Hi. Going back to your experience with Nancy Grace in the prison and interviewing those women, how did you go about setting up those interviews so that they were more of a learning experience? Obviously, you were trying to tell those women's stories and kind of more so explain that it's not just you get in prison. There's stuff that goes on before that, and there's a lot of things that happened before that. So how did you set that up? How did Nancy set that up while interviewing, and how did you set it up while filming to make it sort of more of a learning experience rather than a judging experience for these women?
It's a good question. First of all, let me say Nancy didn't set anything up. She just showed up. That's what I was for. That's what producers are for. And that's not with all on-air talent. Some are different. Some are very involved. Some just say, tell me what time and when to be there. But my pitch to the women was, and I'm trying to remember how we got these women. We basically had gone through the prison roll and the roster and pre-screened and kind of selected 30 different women. And then we had conversations with prison officials who knew all these women, because these prison officials get to know them. And they kind of gave us some suggestions about, well, this person would be interesting. This is a little bit about what we know about her story. So once we had kind of our cast, our 7, 8, 12 inmates, it wasn't terribly difficult to have conversations with them, primarily just because they don't get to talk to anybody. Now, there is also an element of, you show up with a camera at a prison and everybody wants to talk and they all want to tell you how innocent they are. But what I explained to these women in our conversations was, I'm not here to adjudicate whether you should be here. That's not why we're here. We're here because that's in the past. Obviously, we're going to ask you, what it was that got you here. But really what the goal of the story was to learn what the experience is like for women to be incarcerated and what their day-to-day life was like there. So we didn't really harp on whether they did or didn't commit a crime. It was almost like, you're here in a jumpsuit, you probably committed the crime. And to be fair, a lot of these women were very honest and were like, oh yeah, I did that. I mean, I'm guilty. these were not these were tough, hardened women, and so they were not afraid to tell you what they had done. So we didn't have a lot of difficulty in, whether we were judging them or not. They pretty much knew why they were there and what they did, and our approach was less about their crime and more about, we want to tell the viewers what life is like inside here.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, guys, last call for any questions.
There's got to be one or two more.
I know, there's got to be out there. Somebody who's shy.
How many of you guys are looking to go into journalism? I will say this. There's been a lot of discussion in the last few years about journalists, journalism, what is real and what is not. And I would tell you to not for a second be discouraged by those conversations. Journalism is an exceptionally noble job, no matter what anyone will tell you. It is an incredibly important job. There are times that I have lost sight of that and I forget that. But, I have never been more proud of my profession and my industry than I have been for the last, few years. Because in the face of incredible conflict and criticism and disdain, at the end of the day, it's always the journalist and it's always the truth that winds up standing. And so I'm happy to see that there are people that still consider journalism a career worth pursuing.
All right. Well, I think that that's probably as good a place as any to wrap this up. Thank you so much.
No problem. Happy to do it.
Yeah, this has been great. And if these students out of the glare of the video screen come up with questions later, maybe they can forward them on to you. And
sure. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, all those places.
Perfect.
So,
well, thanks so much, everybody. And that's it for today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.